They found a cabin deep in the Appalachian, and what they discovered inside revealed a terrible life lived alone for 60 years. September 1987, the golden leaves of autumn painted the Kentucky mountains in shades of amber and crimson, when Forest Ranger Daniel McCarthy stumbled upon something that would haunt him forever. Deep within the most isolated reaches of the Daniel Boone National Forest, where fog clings to the valleys like ghostly fingers and civilization feels like a distant memory, he found a structure that shouldn't exist. A weathered cabin, its wooden walls blackened by decades of rain and neglect, stood silent among the towering pines. The air was thick with moisture that morning. Daniel had been tracking illegal logging operations when his compass led him off the marked trails into territory so remote that even the oldest maps showed nothing but blank space. The forest here was ancient, untouched, the kind of wilderness where sound travels differently and every shadow seems to watch. As he pushed through the dense undergrowth of rhododendron and mountain laurel, the cabin materialized before him like an apparition from another century. What struck him first was the absolute silence. No birds sang in these trees. No wind rustled through the branches. The cabin sat in a clearing barely large enough to contain it, surrounded by vegetation so thick it formed natural walls. The structure itself was primitive, built from hand-hewn logs that showed the marks of crude tools. A stone chimney crumbled at one end, and the single window was covered with what appeared to be animal hide stretched across a wooden frame. Daniel approached slowly, his boots crunching on fallen leaves that seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. The door, constructed from rough planks bound with rusted iron strips, hung slightly ajar. He called out, identifying himself as a ranger, but received no response except the echo of his own voice absorbed by the dense forest. When he pushed the door open, the smell hit him immediately. Decay, mildew, and something else, something human and wrong that made his stomach turn. Inside, the cabin was a single room no larger than 15 feet square. What little light penetrated through cracks in the walls revealed a scene of profound isolation. A crude bed frame held a mattress stuffed with what looked like dried moss and leaves. A stone fireplace occupied one wall, its hearth littered with ancient ashes. Shelves fashioned from split logs held jars of preserved food so old their contents had turned black. And everywhere, scratched into the wooden walls, were marks. Thousands of them. Vertical lines grouped in fives, covering every available surface, counting something across decades. But it was the photographs that made Daniel's blood run cold. Tacked to the walls with handmade wooden pegs were dozens of faded images, their edges curled with age and moisture. They showed faces, generations of them, and as Daniel's eyes adjusted to the dim light, he began to notice something deeply disturbing about these people. The features repeated in unsettling ways. The same narrow-set eyes, the same protruding jaw, the same unusual shape of the skull appearing again and again across different decades, different ages, but always the same family characteristics magnified and distorted with each successive generation. In the corner, beneath a pile of moldering blankets, Daniel found her. An elderly woman, barely conscious, her body so frail she seemed more skeleton than flesh. Her face bore the unmistakable features he had seen in the photographs, but taken to an extreme that made her appear almost inhuman. Her skull was elongated and misshapen, her jaw jutted forward at an unnatural angle, and her eyes clouded with cataracts sat too close together in a face that evolution had clearly abandoned long ago. She could barely speak, her words coming out in a dialect so thick and strange that Daniel struggled to understand. But what he did comprehend chilled him to the bone. She had been born in this cabin. Her parents had been born in this cabin. Her grandparents had built this cabin after fleeing here in the 1820s. And for over 160 years, her family had lived here in complete isolation, generation after generation, never leaving these mountains, never seeing another soul from the outside world. The medical team that airlifted her out 3 days later would discover the full horror of her existence. DNA tests would reveal levels of genetic similarity that should be impossible in humans. Her parents had been first cousins. Their parents had been siblings. And this pattern extended back through at least 6 generations of the family. Each union between closer and closer relatives produced children whose bodies bore the terrible cost of such profound inbreeding. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because what you are about to discover in the coming chapters will reveal one of the most shocking cases of family isolation and genetic consequences ever documented in American history. A story so disturbing it was kept secret by authorities for over a decade. The story of this family began in 1823 when brothers Ezekiel and Josiah Stilwell fled into the Appalachian wilderness to escape justice. Court records from Harlan County, Kentucky, revealed that the brothers had been accused of relations with their own sisters, a crime that carried severe punishment in the deeply religious communities of early 19th century America. Rather than face trial and certain execution, they vanished into the mountains with their sisters Rebecca and Sarah, along with their elderly mother, Prudence. The mountains they chose for their exile were among the most forbidding in North America. The terrain was so steep and treacherous that even native tribes rarely ventured into these valleys. Massive rock formations created natural barriers, and the dense canopy of ancient hemlocks and oaks blocked out the sun even at midday. It was a place where a family could disappear completely, and that is exactly what the Stilwells intended. Historical researcher Margaret Chen spent 5 years piecing together the Stilwell story from fragmentary records and the artifacts recovered from the cabin. What she discovered painted a picture of deliberate isolation taken to an extreme rarely seen in human history. The family Bible found in the cabin, its pages brittle and water-stained, contained birth and death records spanning 6 generations. The entries were written in increasingly crude handwriting, reflecting declining literacy with each successive generation. Ezekiel and Rebecca had 7 children together. Josiah and Sarah had 6. When these children reached maturity, they married each other, brother to sister, first cousin to first cousin, in unions that the family patriarch apparently not only permitted but encouraged. The Bible entries suggest this was not accidental but intentional, a deliberate strategy to keep the family pure and isolated from what Ezekiel's increasingly deranged journal entries called the corrupted outside world. Dr. Robert Halloway, a geneticist who analyzed the woman's DNA along with tissue samples from 3 bodies found buried near the cabin, described the genetic consequences as catastrophic. The coefficient of inbreeding, a measure of genetic similarity, was higher than that typically seen in laboratory animals bred specifically for genetic uniformity. Each generation had seen an increase in homozygosity, the presence of identical gene variants inherited from both parents, leading to the expression of recessive genetic disorders that would normally remain hidden. The physical effects were progressive and devastating. Early photographs from the 1880s, found hidden in a metal box beneath the cabin floor, show the 3rd generation of Stilwells with only mild abnormalities, slightly unusual facial features, perhaps a touch of asymmetry. But photographs from the 1920s show faces that were clearly not right. Severely receding chins. Eyes set at different heights. Facial bones that seemed to grow in the wrong directions. By the elderly woman's generation, born in the early 1900s, the genetic damage was profound. Medical examinations revealed that she had been born with severe skeletal abnormalities, including fused vertebrae, malformed hip joints, and bones that had never properly calcified. Her internal organs were misplaced, her heart slightly off-center, one kidney significantly smaller than the other. She had been deaf in one ear since birth and suffered from chronic seizures that her family had simply accepted as normal. But the physical deformities were only part of the story. Psychological evaluations conducted after her rescue revealed cognitive impairments consistent with generations of inbreeding. Her ability to think abstractly was severely limited. Her memory fragmentary and confused. She could remember events from her childhood with strange clarity but could not understand basic concepts like numbers above 10 or the passage of seasons beyond the simple cycle of cold and warm. What haunted the researchers most was her complete lack of understanding that her life was abnormal. She had no concept of the outside world, no comprehension that other ways of living existed. When shown photographs of cities, cars, or even simple towns, she could not process what she was seeing. Her entire universe had consisted of that 15-foot cabin, the small clearing around it, and the creek 50 yards away where the family had drawn water for generations. The journals kept by various family members over the decades, written in progressively deteriorating English, revealed a family that had developed its own isolated culture. They had their own words for things, their own explanations for natural phenomena, their own rituals and beliefs that bore no resemblance to any known religion or tradition. They believed they were the last true people on Earth, that the outside world had been destroyed by some ancient catastrophe, and that their isolation was sacred and necessary. Among the most disturbing discoveries in the cabin were the recordings. In 1952, someone in the Stilwell family, presumably her father, Nathaniel, had acquired a battery-powered tape recorder, likely stolen from an abandoned ranger station or scavenged from hikers who had ventured too close to their territory. Over the course of 15 years, various family members had recorded their voices, creating an audio archive of isolation that researchers found almost unbearable to listen to. The earliest recordings feature Nathaniel's voice, thick with the mountain dialect but still comprehensible, telling stories of his grandfather's time. He speaks of the family's pride in their purity, their determination to remain untainted by outsiders. His words are chilling in their casual acceptance of circumstances that any outside observer would recognize as horrific. He describes his marriage to his sister Abigail as natural and proper, ordained by family tradition. He talks about the children they lost, 6 who died in infancy from complications the family could not understand. Their tiny bodies buried in the woods with nothing but stones to mark their graves. Later recordings from the 1960s feature voices that are barely human. The speakers, including a young version of the woman found in the cabin, have speech impediments so severe that linguists needed months to transcribe the words. The language itself had evolved in isolation, incorporating made-up words and grammatical structures that existed nowhere else on Earth. They spoke of their lives with a matter-of-factness that was deeply unsettling, describing daily routines that revolved around basic survival and the maintenance of family traditions that grew stranger with each generation. One recording from 1967 captured a conversation between the woman and her brother Joseph, who died in 1971 and whose skeletal remains were found in a shallow grave behind the cabin. Their discussion, translated and transcribed, revealed a worldview so limited and distorted that psychologists struggled to classify it. They spoke of the forest as if it were the entire universe, of seasons as if they were living entities with intentions and desires. Joseph mentioned seeing outsiders once, hikers passing through the valley below their mountain, and described them as ghosts or demons, beings from the destroyed world that occasionally manifested to test the family's resolve. The most heart-wrenching recording was her voice from 1973, speaking to her parents who had both recently died of illnesses that would have been easily treatable with basic medical care. Her words, halting and slurred by her malformed jaw and cognitive limitations, expressed a loneliness so profound it was almost unbearable to hear. She talked about being the last one, about maintaining the cabin alone, about the terrible silence that surrounded her now that all the other voices were gone. Anthropologist Dr. Sarah Blackwood, who studied the Stilwell family culture extensively, noted that isolation had created something unprecedented in modern human history. Here was a family that had effectively removed itself from human evolution, creating a closed genetic loop that spiraled inward with each generation. They had their own language, their own culture, their own understanding of reality that bore almost no relationship to the world beyond their mountain. If you feel moved by this story, leave a comment sharing your thoughts to honor the memory of those who lived this tragic history. The physical evidence found in the cabin told stories that the recordings could not. Crude medical instruments fashioned from scrap metal suggested that the family had attempted to treat their own injuries and illnesses with devastating results. Bones that had healed incorrectly, teeth that had been pulled without anesthesia, scarring that indicated infections that had somehow been survived through sheer endurance. A ledger book, its pages filled with drawings made by various family members over decades, showed attempts to record their world, but the images were disturbing in their primitive quality and strange perspectives. Forensic analysis of the graves found near the cabin revealed infant mortality rates approaching 70%. Of the dozens of children born to the Stilwell family over 6 generations, less than a third survived past age 5. Those who did live bore increasingly severe genetic abnormalities. Skeletal remains showed bone deformities, fused joints, and growth patterns that deviated wildly from normal human development. When the elderly woman's case reached the medical community, it sparked intense ethical and scientific debates that continue to this day. Her DNA told a story that geneticists had previously only theorized about. Dr. James Keller, lead researcher at the University of Kentucky's Genetic Disorders Clinic, published a carefully worded paper in 1991 that described the Stilwell family as an unprecedented case study in the effects of extreme consanguinity on human populations. The numbers were staggering. Her genome showed homozygosity levels of over 40%, meaning that nearly half of her genetic material consisted of identical sequences inherited from both parents. In a typical human population, this number hovers around 1% to 3%. The implications were profound and disturbing. Recessive genetic disorders that might appear once in a million births in the general population had manifested in her and her immediate ancestors with virtual certainty. The physical manifestations documented by medical teams were extensive. She suffered from a rare skeletal disorder called mandibulofacial dysostosis, which had caused severe malformations of her jaw and facial bones. She had retinitis pigmentosa, a degenerative eye condition that had left her nearly blind by age 60. Her bone density was equivalent to that of a woman in her hundreds, fragile and porous, causing her constant pain. She had survived to her 80s, not through genetic resilience, but through sheer stubborn endurance in an environment that eliminated anyone weaker. Historical geneticist Dr. Patricia Morrison conducted comparative analysis between the Stilwell case and other documented instances of isolated populations. She examined the genetic records of European royal families who had practiced close intermarriage, religious communities that maintained genetic isolation, and other Appalachian families known for insularity. None approached the Stilwell's level of consanguinity. Even the most extreme cases of European royal inbreeding, such as the Spanish Habsburgs whose genetic coefficient reached 25%, paled in comparison. The Stilwell family had essentially created their own genetic dead end. Mathematical models showed that if the pattern had continued for even one or two more generations, conception itself would have become impossible. The accumulation of lethal recessive alleles would have made every pregnancy non-viable. The family was approaching what biologists call mutational meltdown, the point at which a population becomes so genetically compromised that extinction is inevitable. But beyond the science lay the human tragedy. The woman herself, when she recovered enough to undergo careful interviews with psychologists, could not fully comprehend what had happened to her family or why researchers were so interested in her story. Her cognitive limitations, products of both genetic damage and profound educational neglect, meant she could never truly understand the significance of her own existence. Dr. Helen Morris, the psychologist who worked most closely with her during her final years, described the experience as profoundly disturbing. She had lived more than 80 years without ever experiencing most of what we consider fundamental to human existence. She had never tasted food she did not grow or hunt herself. She had never heard music beyond the sounds of the forest. She had never seen her own reflection in a proper mirror. She had never been touched with affection by anyone outside her immediate family. She had never known that any other way of living was possible. The question that haunted researchers was not just how this happened, but why the family chose this path. Evidence suggested it was not mere accident or geographic isolation. The family had deliberately maintained their separation, had actively avoided contact with the outside world even when opportunities arose. Journals indicated that members of the family had occasionally ventured out, had seen towns and other people, but had always returned to the mountain, convinced of their own superiority and the corruption of the outside world. This delusion, this conviction that their isolated existence was righteous and necessary, had been maintained across generations through a combination of indoctrination and genuine ignorance. Children were taught from birth that they were special, that the outside world was dangerous and evil, that mixing with outsiders would destroy their purity. As genetic damage accumulated and physical deformities became more severe, these beliefs only intensified. The family interpreted their own suffering not as evidence that something was wrong, but as proof of their sacrifice and commitment to their isolated way of life. The elderly woman died on March 14, 1992 in a hospital bed in Lexington, Kentucky, surrounded by machines she never understood and medical staff who represented a world she could never fully comprehend. She was 88 years old. In the 4.5 years between her rescue and her death, she had experienced more change than her entire family had experienced in 160 years of isolation. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, complicated by multiple organ failures. But those who had worked with her knew the truth was more complex. Her body, so thoroughly compromised by generations of genetic damage, had simply reached the limit of what it could endure. Dr. Morrison, who sat with her in her final hours, reported that her last words were in the strange dialect of her mountain isolation, something that roughly translated to, "I want to go home to the cabin." In the years following her discovery, authorities made the difficult decision to burn the Stillwell cabin and seal the area from public access. The site was too dangerous, both physically and psychologically. Hikers and curiosity seekers had already begun attempting to find it, and the last thing the Forest Service wanted was for this place of profound human tragedy to become a tourist attraction. The photographs, recordings, and artifacts were archived at the University of Kentucky under strict access protocols. But the questions raised by the Stillwell case continue to resonate. How many other families might exist in similar isolation, hidden in remote areas where authorities never venture? The Appalachian Mountains alone contain thousands of square miles of territory so rugged and inaccessible that comprehensive surveys have never been completed. Could other pockets of extreme isolation persist even now in the 21st century? Genealogical research revealed that the Stillwell family had distant relatives scattered throughout Kentucky and Tennessee. Descendants of siblings who had chosen not to flee into the mountains in 1823. These families, when contacted by researchers, expressed shock and horror at what their isolated cousins had become. Several provided photographs and records that filled in gaps in the Stillwell family history, creating a complete picture of two branches of the same family tree. One branch had joined the modern world, integrated into society, and thrived. The other had withdrawn into isolation and destroyed itself through genetic catastrophe. The ethical implications troubled researchers for years. Should this story be made public? Would it serve any purpose beyond satisfying morbid curiosity? Ultimately, a decision was made to release limited information through academic channels while protecting the dignity and privacy of those involved. This narrative represents one of the few detailed accounts of the Stillwell case approved for public consumption. And even here, certain details have been omitted or modified to respect the dead. Margaret Chen, the historian who devoted years to documenting the Stillwell story, concluded her research with a disturbing observation. The family's tragedy was not simply the result of isolation and inbreeding. It was the product of a choice repeated across generations to reject connection with the broader human community. In their determination to remain pure and separate, they had created something impure and broken. Their story serves as a dark reminder of what humans can become when we sever ourselves from each other. When we convince ourselves that our way is the only way. When we choose isolation over integration. Today, the valley where the Stillwell cabin once stood has returned to wilderness. Young trees grow where the clearing used to be. The creek still runs cold and clear. If you did not know what to look for, you would never guess that humans had lived and died there for over a century and a half. Nature has reclaimed the space and erased the evidence of the Stillwell family's tragic experiment in isolation. But their genetic legacy persists in the samples stored at research facilities, a permanent record of what happens when human populations become too small and too isolated. Their DNA has contributed to our understanding of genetic disorders, has helped researchers identify markers for rare conditions, and has provided cautionary data about the limits of human genetic diversity. If you have watched until this point, you have witnessed one of the most tragic true stories in American history. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel for more deeply researched historical cases that reveal the hidden corners of our past. If you watched until here, leave a comment saying I watched until here so I can know who really appreciates the stories on this channel. Give this video a like if this story moved you and share it with others who appreciate serious historical documentation. These stories matter because they remind us of the importance of connection, community, and the terrible price of isolation taken to its extreme.